welcome to tonight's event, and I'm going to keep it very brief. My name is Rachel. I am a bookseller here at Boswell. Today is day 5,424, Boswell being in business, and that's thanks to you all. This event tonight is co-sponsored by Lion's Tooth, which is another wonderful bookstore here in Milwaukee. Here to talk about it is Chris.
Hello. First, I wanna thank Rachel and Daniel and Boswell for having us and to consistently reaching out to the community and to the newbie booksellers, which we are. Yeah. And Lion's Tooth is a very small space. It's smaller than this probably. It's 600 square feet. It's on KK. It's only me, my business partner, Shelly McClone Carriere there. And we focus a lot on comics. So if you like this wonderful work that you're gonna see today, you will like Lion's Tooth too. We try to do programming as well. We have something else in the works with Boswell already and secret so far, but we'll know. With me, I don't wanna spoil the announcement. But if you have Boswell's newsletter, it's definitely gonna be there, and it's definitely on our newsletter too. And thank you guys so much for supporting booksellers. Everybody said bookstores were gonna be gone. Look at this. So it's something that Milwaukee has to be proud of. All right.
Alrighty. And without further ado, I'm just going to pass this right along to my fellow bookseller who knows better and is smarter than me anyway. So welcome to Oli, who will introduce you to the rest.
All right. Hi, everyone. My name is Oli, and I use they, them pronouns. And I am so excited to be here tonight with the incredible Milwaukee local illustrator, my ed professor, and author of the graphic novel M is for Monster. And for those of you who haven't read it yet, M is for Monster follows a scientist's attempt to bring her younger sister Maura back to life, Frankenstein style, from the perspective of M, the being who comes into consciousness in Maura's body, but without Maura's memories or personality. With us tonight is Talia Dutton.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, we are so glad this came together. I wanted to start with what drew you to write this specific story? What interested you about the topic, or where did you start?
So actually, I can trace the start of this comic very specifically back to a sketch in my sketchbook when I was in grad school. And it was just a little doodle of a face that was stitched together, but was like a little kid. And it was basically, I just wrote next to it like Frankenstein, but a child. And then directly next to that, there was actually a design for for a belt, like a Batman belt. And it was like, what if I sold utility belts to nerds? So that was my other business plan for if this didn't work out. But I love monsters. I love monster stories, not in the like horror way. I feel like M's for Monster often gets sort of shunted into like the horror category, and I don't see it as that so much as coming of age, sort of young adults figuring out who you are and what you're doing here kind of story. I took like classes in college that talked about monsters in terms of like where we pull our monsters from. And it's so much about this idea of the other. And I love the idea of the other being like, well, okay, yeah, then we're going to be cool monsters. It's like, if we're going to be monsters, then yeah, absolutely, let's do it. I loved reading like X-Men and stuff like that, things that were families of outsiders. And that was what this was sort of originally intended to be, was the story of a big family of monsters. And then my editor was like, you were trying to talk about too much stuff at once. You've got to narrow it down. So hopefully I'll come back to some of that stuff later. But yeah, monsters as family, like monsters as beings that are proud of who they are and loved is kind of where I was going with it.
Yeah, I love that so much. And that's part of what drew me to read the story and be really excited about to begin with as well. Because I just love that it really goes into having other people place expectations onto you, which is very common as a teenager and throughout any time in your life. And then like having to figure out how you are going to live outside of those on your own terms. I also wanted to ask about like with things like the X-Men, were there other monster favorites that came up as you were developing your story?
Yeah, I read a lot. There's like weirdly a lot of graphic novels about ghost friends. So I read a lot of Anya's Ghost by Vera Brosgol. I read Friends with Boys by Faith Erin Hicks. It's not a big part of it, the story, the ghost, and that's kind of why like it's very much not about being a ghost story, but also there are ghosts. And I think there was one other, it was Lisa Brown's The Phantom Twin, I think was a big influence. It's got similar themes to what I was going for. But if I were to go back further, I feel like a lot of my understanding of monsters came from Eva Ibbetson's books when I was little. She wrote a bunch of stories that were about like families of ghosts, like the Great Ghost Rescue and Witch and like the Secret of Platform 13, I think.
Yeah.
And I loved those books so much. These idea of these friendly monsters, these friendly outsiders that just sort of casually loved each other, and where things like being able to float through walls was sort of like a fun novelty that you just loved and accepted about the people who were around you because it was just part of who they were. And I think that definitely influenced my whole take on monsters as much more of a friendly entity.
Yeah, and I definitely see it more broadly with people being drawn to these stories that have like found family or paranormal found family or this sort of like you were talking about with the X-Men with these types of stories that you love, like people being together and loving one another and like being other, but it doesn't necessarily or even if they're other from another. I lost my train of thought, but
Fair.
found family is great, people.
Yeah.
And we should all be reading it. I wanted to ask as well with Mora in the story. So the M is not Mora, doesn't have her memories, but sees flashes of her as a ghost in mirrors, so is communicating with us. So if monsters are the other, what are ghosts for you?
I mean, I think ghosts fall into that category. It's just, it's impossible. The minute you try to sort of force other into a box, like there's a million different ways that you can be something else. And I think for this, if I tried to narrow this down into like a cohesive metaphor, it would definitely slip through my fingers. But it was this. Mora is just sort of the ghost of expectations, I guess. And I mean, that's such a big part of this is the expectations of who people wanted you to be. And I wanted to sort of literalize that into I literally wanted you to be somebody else, a different person who I already know. But I have a very hard time making my characters be mean to each other. So I also wanted Mora to be a friendly ghost and have this, connection. I didn't want my character to be completely alone. In this, I never want my characters to be completely alone, even though I probably should sometimes so they can go through stuff.
Well, they definitely still go through stuff, but that definitely hits so hard with because you even hear it in the way that sometimes parents talk about their kids changing, like, I don't know who you are anymore, or like acting as though they've lost a child when someone goes through like a big change that they weren't expecting. So
I mean, the very basic idea of like having a kid, like it's impossible. You're not going to be like, I have no thoughts about what this child is going to become at all. It's whatever happens, it's completely a blank after this child is born. It's just a white void. Like you're going to expect things, you're going to anticipate things, and it sort of becomes about the ability to change and along with that. And I think Francis's character as this person who expects M to be someone else I never thought of it. I've always felt a great sympathy for her because she's not being cruel on purpose. She's stuck in her expectations in, you know, she sort of ripped science apart to bring back her little sister, and it's she just has to learn to move forward from that not working, and somebody being outside of her control, which I think is hard for a mad scientist not to be able to control something.
Yeah. Well, I think it's done so well, and that the book can really serve to like help people who are struggling with that, struggling to let go with that story. Speaking of Frances, the sciencey sister, we also have M, the being who comes into consciousness and is reawakened, and Jin, the partner of Frances. What went into character creation for you? What did you draw from that for that?
I think M stayed pretty much the same from the very beginning. It was this sort of innocent blank slate of a nice kid, kid who's just trying their best, trying her best, trying to figure out what she's doing, where she wants to go, what she wants to be. And I think, Emma's a little bit me, and Frances is also a little bit me. I think Emma's also a little bit my younger sister, and sort of her coming into a family of a lot of people who are just like big, just going straight through all the academics, and me wanting to tell her that she didn't have to. And in that way, and I think my parents are very cool people. They were very supportive of me becoming an artist. But the sort of expectations of being well-rounded as a person and all that, like I think I pulled a little bit from that experience, but I think more honestly from like the experience of a lot of my friends, because I was a little highly gifted kid running around taking way too many AP classes, and I saw the way my friends interacted with their parents. There was way more pressure there, and I was always grateful I didn't have. But it's the pressure to be something, to be a doctor, to be a specific gender, to be just who you wanted somebody to be. It's in so many places. Jin went through a million different iterations. I always wanted there to be like a fun sidekick character. And most of the time Jin was just sort of vibing in the corner. And I was like, all right, this is a character where I don't have to feel so fraught with, oh my God, what emotions are they going through all the time? And they're still one of my favorite characters I've ever created, because they're just hanging out, being weird, trying to be supportive of everybody at once.
Yeah, that's one of my favorite panels in the book, is Jin just like leaning over in the kitchen like, well, that was my lecture. Do you want some tea? Like,
she's just trying to figure things
fantastic.
out, helping everybody out, getting through it. Yeah, I mean, I think characters, I tend to write more from plot, and the characters follow that. So the characters came into shape once I figured out where they needed to go, and then I just sort of let them talk, I guess, a little bit.
Yeah. So did you have the plot outlined like very close to when you started working on this as a story?
Kind of. I didn't have it like when I started out, it didn't spring into my head like this is what the plot is. I find writing to be actually very difficult. So it took me a very long time to sort of perpetually write and rewrite and rework this story to coming to any kind of any kind of sort of plot that made sense. It's hard sort of pulling together not only the emotional beats, but also like, does the logic, like for a sort of slightly science fiction story, you have to make sure that the pieces sort of fall into place and make some amount of sense. Like if I come up with a rule, like this character shows up in mirrors, like how do I, how does that factor into this later part where I have a mirror and, I need to be able to have them see it or not see it, or they need to be able to carry it. I had to be like, oh, they have to carry around like a mirror compact, because the mirror has to be in other scenes outside even. So like writing the story took a really long time. It took a lot of work with my amazing editor, Mariko Tamaki, who is a wonderful author in her own right. And her just being like, all right, cut this part out. You're trying to do too much all at once. Overthinking this.
Yeah.
So before I like finally got the plot, and then honestly after that, writing it was way easier.
So like things fell into place after you had.
Yeah. Once I
the
have everything in the
direction.
right place, writing the scenes, writing dialogue,
Yeah.
it flows a lot easier.
Yeah. So from that sketch in a grad school notebook, when did you know that you wanted to turn it into a full-length story, into a graphic novel?
Originally, this was actually going to be my like grad school thesis. So I knew the sort of premise of my grad school was you go there for 3 years and then you create a full story. And I think most of the time it ended up people created like 20 pages of a full story. And so I was just working towards this thesis with this, trying to refine it, talking to all of my different advisors and people. And that's what Mariko saw. She saw some of my like process work and then was like, hey, do you want to turn this into a full graphic novel? And I was like, absolutely, yes,
Yeah.
please, hello. And I actually ended up a little bit funnily, had to finish some pages for my thesis, but I was also completely revising the story at the same time. So I have a bunch of pages that are from like I guess like a parallel universe of this story that don't feature into this at all because they happen before the story takes place or the characters are slightly out of character. That I don't never know what to do with them because they're sort of non-canon, I guess.
M is also for multiverse.
You're right.
This could be a spinoff.
Spin-off. Just multiple universe. Fan fiction of my own work.
Yeah, absolutely.
AU where nothing bad happens. They're all fine.
We love that. I mean, the people love that. We
Yeah.
create that all the time. Is there anything else you can tell us about taking this from a like graphic novel concept to final draft? Was it mostly working on it while you were working on it as a thesis?
Yeah, I mean, so as a process, it starts out, I did a lot of like free writes just to get out of my own head, writing a bunch of stuff down and then trying to refine it into something. I wrote a bunch of scenes that didn't end up in any way in the final story. That gave me a pretty good sense of the characters I was working with and how they interacted with each other. And so like after banging out the script and then revising it and sort of melting it down and forming it back up again over and over again, I wrote out the script, sort of passed that back and forth with my editors a couple of times, and then I think I did the most of the art for this, like from thumbnails, which is sort of like little versions of each page to figure out where everything goes, figure out where the text is going to go, where the characters are going to go. It's a lot of like little, if you look at them, like here's this little smiley face, speech bubble, like a literal stick figure. And then I sort of took that to full pages and started drawing everything, putting everything in place. And then after that, I inked everything. I actually ended up having to have an inking assistant because I ran out of time because I spent too long writing the dang thing. And the publishing date was approaching a little bit too fast. So they're like, all right, we'll find somebody who can mimic your style and do a couple of pages, background stuff so that I could fill in the main characters. And then after that, I passed it off to a colorist to do. I colored a couple pages to show them what I wanted, and then I was basically passing pages off to them like as this sort of factory line of like, all right, I finished page, color, color, finished page, color. And like that whole process, because I'd spent so long writing, ended up being about 10 months in total, from finalizing like script getting signed off to pages being done.
Yeah.
I was actually also moving to Milwaukee at the time, and I drove from California with my dad, and we were stopping at hotels every night. So I would stop at a hotel and then like whip out my tablet setup and like put it on this tiny little hotel. Like, they've got a table and it's about this wide for some reason, and like trying to ink like 2 pages every night in these like little hotels after having driven for like 6 hours every day.
Oh my God. Can I ask which route did you go? North Milwaukee or south, or was it just in a fugue state?
No idea.
Okay, yeah, it was in a coming up on book deadline. Yep.
Yeah.
So actually, with the inking and the shading, the book has this gorgeous color scheme. I really like the particular like greenish hue that is present there. Was it something that you knew you wanted to work with, or like a collaborative decision? How did we get that color in the book?
The honest and not particularly interesting answer to that is that for the amount of money they were willing to spend on publishing this book. They were like, you get 2 colors and one of them is black. You could do whatever you want with any combination of black and one other color that you get to
Oh my
pick.
God.
And I was like, I like turquoise. And so I picked turquoise and I went from there. Yeah, so it was a boring answer is they said you get one, and I picked a color that I just like
Yeah.
looking at.
Yeah. Well, I think it fits the story pretty well too. I don't know if you were one of those kids who's like, the green folder is for science classes.
Yes,
The green notebook is science.
green is science.
Green is science.
Yellow
And
is
so I look at
English.
this and I see this turquoise and I'm like, yeah, it's green. It's science. It's cool.
Yeah, it's science.
It's science.
And it's like bluish green, which is
Yeah.
weird science.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's like alternate science.
Alternate science.
Yeah, absolutely.
Not fully science. Color theory. Red. Yeah. I know there's debate around that one, but I think it's red.
English was red for me. Let's move on. Is there an aspect of the book or the art that you like wish you got to talk more about or tell people about?
There's lots of silly details in there that are just from like my own nerd brain.
Yeah.
Like I mean, a big part of this was about sewing, and it sort of the metaphor got a little bit lost on me at some points when I was writing this, but I sewed a lot growing up, and I worked in my like theater costume shop in college, just like sewing costumes for the actors and stuff like that. Actually, Dottie, this older woman who sort of helps stitch M back together, like in a way that makes her look more like Mora. Who's this sort of benevolent character, is very much her whole house is based on the costume shop I used to work in. I like set up the shelves in the same way. I was thinking about like we had all these little containers with thread, and we had this sort of big rolls of paper for plotting things out. And I was putting all of these little details of stuff like that in there. And a lot of the costumes for the character as well. It's weird that I think about them as costumes and not just their clothes.
It's very theater kid of you.
It is very theater kid of me, but it's like costuming actors. You know, you're putting them in clothes and sending them to tell a story. I spent so much time overthinking that. I like wrote papers about sportswear in the 1940s America in college. And so I very deliberately clothed the characters. Because I think a lot of people forget when they're thinking about costumes that nobody was wearing the like most recent, most up-to-date clothing at any given time. You know, you're wearing the clothes you bought 5 years ago, 10 years ago, if it still fits. And so I was very much pulling Frances into slightly older outfits. I was pulling a little bit more Edwardian for most of her stuff. Because she's stuck in the past. Like literally she's holding on to relationships and things that she had 10 years ago. And Mora's stuff was a little bit more up to date in sort of 1920s sense, 1920s sportswear, sort of like the young collegiate sort of characters. And then M ended up, I sort of tried to pull it a little bit more 1930s. So I was very much trying to span these different, slightly different time periods for these different characters to show where they were and what they were doing without all of that. Which is my big nerd thing. And this was me just wanting to stick like little bits of representation in stuff. I was very proud that I managed to set up the sort of classic mad scientist button down the side sort of lab coat, but I sort of reoriented it a little bit so that the color actually mimics the direction of like a qipao, which is like a like 1910s, 1920s like Shanghai Chinese look. And I was trying to pull those things together for Frances, which is just like a little detail that nobody but me would ever notice.
But that's so cool. And I love that you think about clothing your characters like a costumer would, and what is the clothing communicating. That's so cool. And with like clothing and art style and things like that, are there parts of your style that stay very consistent for you going from project to project or thing to thing, or does your style change a lot?
I think art style is so hard to pin down. I mean, there was periods of time in college, even grad school, where I was like absolutely convinced I had no consistent art style and I was never going to find it, and nobody was ever going to, every piece was going to be completely different. And I think looking back at a lot of the stuff I was making during that time period, I can absolutely see a similar thread of style. So while I look at the stuff I made in M's for Monster and in other works. And I'm like, oh man, this looks completely different. Like I'm drawing, faces different. I'm using different brushes and pens and color palettes and stuff like that. I think there's actually probably way more connection between stuff than I think there is.
Mhm.
Although every now and then I'm like, I just want to do a completely like realistic painting where I'm just looking at something and drawing. It's very relaxing to me because I don't have to think about things as hard as I do for illustrations. And then I look at that and I'm like, well, this doesn't go with anything. I can't put this anywhere.
Oh,
This
no.
doesn't go with any of the other stuff I have on my website or anything.
Yeah. It's sort of like musical artists. Some of them will just be like, here's an EP of all the songs I worked on in the last 10 years. And then sometimes they'll be like, this is curated. I wrote 100 and here are 10 of them that fit together in
Yeah.
one thing.
That's what all portfolios are for
Yeah.
artists as well. You're like, here's the ones that worked.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. So are there things that you specifically noticed about your style that stay with you, or is it just like amorphous, like something is there that's consistent?
I mean, some things are consistent. I know that there's like strategies I have when I'm drawing. Like I probably do hair a similar way where I just like blob in big blocks of light and dark and shape. I know that when a character gets a little bit too small on the page, I immediately default to little like lines for eyes, which can be a little bit disconcerting because the other side of that is very realistic eye. And there's like you'll see even in this book, like I was reading it earlier, trying to remember what I wrote several years ago. And I was like, oh my God, it's just jumping drastically between like a character with these beautifully rendered eyes and then like 2 dots.
Yeah.
And I was like, maybe I shouldn't have done that. But I do that for everything. It's sort of how you have to get stuff to work. You can't draw photorealistic eyes on a character that's this big. It's gonna look really weird.
Yeah, I also love in this book something that's kind of consistent across the characters is like when there's an emotional statement being made, they kind of come out of the frame of the panel they're in. Like Frances does one where she's like, I fixed you.
Yeah.
And there's another one of M like looking really cute, like big eyes and like elbows are hanging off the frame a little bit. And I love those little things.
I just like breaking the frames. It's I don't break things. I'm a very neat person, but I love breaking frames and getting the characters like you don't have to put them in a box. They're bigger than the box.
Yeah.
I mean it's like a variation on the classic illustration. My background is a rectangle.
Yeah.
There's a rectangle that the character doesn't quite fit in. And that's just what comics are.
Yeah.
So I don't even think I noticed I was doing it for big emotional things. It's just that's when it feels right to break out of the box.
Absolutely. You leave all your breaking for the comic boxes.
Yeah. I mean, that was I think my favorite stuff to draw was like the big pages where there was like an explosion or something happening. It's just a lot of crazy lines going in different directions all the way to the borders. Those are the most fun because they were just scribbling things around. My phone is telling me to feed my cat. She'll be fine.
She's gonna be okay.
She'll be fine. That's like I've changed the schedule and I just never turned that alarm off.
Oh my goodness. We're an 8 p.m. cat dinner.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. And can you talk a bit about your path to becoming a professional illustrator? You talked about some of your grad school experience already, but how you developed as an artist.
I mean, it was real weird. I don't think it was. It's as the story goes. It starts out the classic. I drew all the time on everything with everything. I painted things. I loved children's books. I loved looking at things. I had friends. We were pulling up the old like Dauler's Greek myth book, and we were talking about how those like designs of the sort of gods shaped everything. I was thinking like, oh yeah, I drew those on all of my notebooks and everything.
Were you the cool kid in middle school where like someone could be like, I want you to draw a dog, and you'd be like,
no,
dog. No,
I can't draw dogs. There was a cool kid
there was
who could
the
draw
dog
dogs,
kid.
and then there was me who was like, well, I could do a replica of The Birth of Venus by Botticelli, and they were like, what are you talking about? What does that mean? Why is she naked?
Oh my God.
Yeah, they didn't like the nudity in 6th grade.
That's so
It made
cool.
them uncomfortable. But yeah, so I drew on everything, and then I think I kept drawing in the side backgrounds. I had this amazing like local art school that I just basically every Friday I would go in and I'd sit down and they'd be like, what do you want to draw? And you'd show them a picture of something you wanted to draw and they would help you draw it. And it was this amazing, just sort of like little space where you developed your work. It was also called the Wizard of Art, which is an amazing name for an art school. And they just had a big like standee of a wizard outside, like a classic wizard. It was amazing. I owe them a lot. They were, but in college, I technically majored in visual art. I went to Brown, which is weird because RISD was right there. And then I went to Brown and I majored in visual art, which seems extra weird. But I spent most of my time just hanging out in the theater department with the theater kids.
Yeah.
I did very little like real art other than for what I need to do for my classes. But I also spent a bunch of time drawing fan art of like podcasts that I was listening to. Drew a lot of Adventure Zone podcasts, fan art and stuff like that. I was like watching Carrie Peach sort of become the person at the time, being like, oh wow. And you know, I think so much of that, despite it being fan art and not sort of fitting into a professional portfolio necessarily, really helped me develop like a style and process and just like get enough confidence to do more stuff. And so as I was doing all of that, I decided I wanted to do graduate art school. I knew it wasn't going to be like doing art school again, but I wanted to focus in on it. And I think, you know, it was fine for what it was. Like, it was graduate school, and I don't know if I should have paid the amount of money I did for it, but it did help me make all of the connections that I needed to publish.
Yeah.
I think was the huge thing. I mean, it was in San Francisco, so it was a lot of just like famous comic artists who lived around there being like, I could teach a class, sure, whatever. And I'd be like, oh wow, I've read your book and your other book.
Yeah.
I think actually when I met Mariko Tamaki, who's amazing and a friend now, I said the words, I want to address the elephants in the room. You're like a real person. And she was like, okay, sure. So yeah, it was a ton about meeting other people. I think like even now drawing fan art has drastically improved my art style and like figuring out process. I did like this incredibly convoluted crossover fan art series but I was doing so much of it that I like figured out what brushes I liked. I figured out how to do backgrounds for it. Like there's nothing that gets you better at something than committing to like a goof. Or like something silly that you're just passionate about and just doing it a bunch. Yeah,
that is awesome. And I think we're seeing that now. Like, authors are saying like, oh, I was obsessed with these characters and I wrote fan fiction about them, and I learned how to write like mystery novels from like putting these characters in mysteries, or like developed your style from like having characters that you were passionate about already, because it seems kind of hard to generate a story you can care about from the very start when you don't have it completely fleshed out. But if you're like, I know what happens with these characters and I love them and I will do anything to make more of them.
It's like hard to practice, you know, drawing characters or drawing poses when you're also trying to practice writing characters and writing stories. Like, those are all very difficult things. So like taking some of those things out just for the purposes of practicing even is just fantastic. I know all the teachers here in the room are like shaking their heads at me.
Maybe not what your fellow teachers would say, but do you have any special advice for folks who want to become illustrators or create their own graphic novel works?
I think it's a similar vein. Make a lot of stuff. Just keep drawing. If you finish one piece, move on to the next. Even if you think the piece was keep going. There's nothing that makes you better at art than making a lot of it. Even if you're unhappy with it. And I think that there's nothing that helps you make a lot of it like being really excited about it as well. So, you know, push yourself. Use, like, I think there's one thing to draw the same thing over and over again, but it's another to be like, well, I'm going to use this as an excuse to practice backgrounds. Or I'm going to use this as an excuse to practice poses. And, you know, using the passion that you have for characters and for things to push yourself in new directions. It's, you know, it can get you kind of stuck, but it can also fuel you in fun new directions. And, you know, put your work out there. I think my friends are constantly telling me, like, don't self-sabotage. Don't be like, my art's not good enough for this thing. Just put it out there. Like, what's the worst that could happen? Somebody could say they don't like it. That immediately puts them in a mean person category, and then you don't have to listen to them.
Exactly. Yeah, that is an excellent strategy. And before I turn it over to Q&A, I want to ask if there are any projects you're working on now that you're allowed to talk about that aren't secret.
I'm trying to write another one. It's hard.
Nice.
Writing's hard. it's hard. I'm doing the same thing where I'm like trying to piece everything together.
Mhm.
It's not working. But there's a couple of other projects that I'm working on that I'm not allowed to talk about right now, but I'm hoping
Oh.
they go somewhere. That'd be very exciting.
So Talia Dutton has secrets.
Secrets.
Yeah.
Contain mysteries.
All right. I
should
want
talk
to.
about poison.
You what?
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 Unrelated. Don't worry about it.
Okay. So we're gonna do some Q&A. Because we are recording the event, I'm gonna repeat the question after it's said so that it goes into the microphone. But yeah, if anyone wants to raise their hand, has a question for Talia about M is for Monster illustration. Hello.
Hey, Andy. Yeah. Oh, I'm so glad you asked this.
A very thoroughly designed bric-a-brac, shelves, everything house, and there are many, many different viewpoints of this place, as we call it. It all seems very thoroughly done and self-consistent, and I am wondering if this is the trick where each time you have drawn in a frame what you need for that point of the story, or if you are also mentally going through a space that you've done.
So Andy's question is about whether, with the amazing house and laboratory in the book that we see from so many different perspectives, whether Talia designed it beforehand and like knew where everything was going to be, or just showed what needed to be shown, and that it's a trick or a magic miracle that it ends up being really consistent and feeling like a real space.
If it had been a trick or a magic miracle, it would have taken me way less time. I'm so glad you asked this. I actually forgot I wanted to talk about this. The house is, so I got really up in my head about like, whenever we have fantasy, it's always very, England based.
Yeah.
I felt like, and I was like, okay, I wanted to pull a little bit further away from that. So I went and I found there's a small town in northern Spain that I did like a month-long art retreat in once. So from California, where I started working on the book, I looked up real estate listings for this small town in northern Spain. And I found a house that had 360 cameras put in the room. And so there was a bunch of pictures from the outside, and then there was 360 cameras on the inside. And I thoroughly screenshotted tons of the house in different directions. Like some of the furniture in there is directly pulled from inside this one random house in the countryside outside of Camillas, Spain. It did not, but it had a really big like open space. So that comes to the next part of this, which I probably didn't need to do, and it took me a very long time, was I was like, well, I want to be able to see more of it and move it around. Like, perspective's really hard. Putting things in places is hard. Drawing stuff is hard. Mirrors are hard. And I decided I was going to put those everywhere. And so I was like, what would be fun to do and easy is to teach myself how to 3D model things
that
from
seems
scratch.
so fun and easy.
And so I learned... I went directly from this guy who was teaching me how to do like juice boxes that you could rotate in space to modeling a house. So I did the basics of the house, but then I modeled individual rooms. And I didn't it didn't have all the furniture in there, but it had like, okay, there's going to be a counter here, and there's going to be about a railing here, and basic stuff for stairs and windows. And I'd spent way too long trying to figure out how to make like a reflective surface so I could have that, which was very helpful. But yeah, so it was a combination of a real house that I found on a real estate listing that I actually still get emails for because I'm bad at removing myself from email lists. And teaching myself how to use Blender, the 3D modeling program, so that I could literally rotate the camera around in a space and figure out how lighting would work and things like that.
Are you glad that you did learn the 3D modeling? Like, do you use it for other things?
I don't know if it was worth the amount of time I put into it for this. Like the sheer amount of time I spent modeling versus the amount of time it maybe would have taken me had I just sort of set up something way simpler. But it was a great procrastination method.
Yeah. All right. In favor of 3D modeling is procrastination here. Other questions? Yes.
Already, but is there something that you learned like during the creation of this project that's like, or is for Monster that you think is going to stick with you for future projects?
Oh
The
God.
question is, if Talia learned something during the process of creating M is for Monster, it's going to stay with you for future projects, good or bad?
I mean, tons of stuff, like tons of things I'm probably not going to be able to like explain. They're in my brain now because I had never written a story that was that long before. I'd never made a comic longer than 25 pages before this, and this book is 216 pages. So like just the sheer amount of getting through the whole process, everything, putting the characters in there, figuring out backgrounds, figuring out how to write dialogue and everything, like all of that was a little bit too new when I was doing it for this book. So I mean, I learned a ton from it. I think probably the most concrete thing is Blender, but there's a million little details and things that I had to figure out to do this. I also learned that muffin wrappers were not invented until after I had this story set in my brain, because I had muffins in one scene and I was like, they can't have wrappers. I can't show the muffins because I don't know what you would do with them outside of this.
Oh
So
my
yeah, it was
God.
fun.
That's amazing. I saw another question over here as well.
And eventually the trying to make it work kind of becomes right, and that resentment then bubbles over, and then all of the emotions kind of turn negative. And then I'm just curious about your choice. Like, I'm curious about resentment is really the question, and like, what were your choices around themes, and why did you choose ultimately to resolve things kind of in a way that resulted in harmony as opposed to maybe discord?
This is a question about the emotions in the book and how following other people's expectations can lead to resentment. So a question about the choice to include resentment, how you engage with the themes around it, and why you decided to end things in harmony instead of keeping it in that resentful space.
I think resentment is a very I don't think I would say I chose to include this idea, like land on resentment outside of the rest of the emotions. It definitely like makes a lot of sense to me that in trying to repress who you are as a person, you would end up resenting the people who were asking you to do that. Even if they weren't asking you to repress something, they just thought that they were asking you to be who you are. And I'm, I was a shy kid, so I had a hard time asking for things and asking to do things and stuff like that. So I'm sort of familiar with not asking for things and holding on to them, just sort of being, holding all your emotions right there. And then just not doing anything with them. And it's not like I was dealing with big things necessarily where I was like, I've got a big secret that I'm holding, but it's like, it's little things.
Yeah.
And what is fiction but sort of exacerbating some of those little things for a good story. I think the answer to the other question about why did I end it the way I did, is kind of I wanted them to be happy. I like happy stories. I feel like the world sucks too much to read sad stories sometimes. And I actually, this was a big conversation that I was having. He probably wasn't perceiving it as a conversation he was having with me, but one of my teachers in grad school, John Jennings, who's this amazing, he does graphic novels. He actually does Megascope, which is the other imprint from Abrams. And he liked to talk about sort of representation in especially fantasy, sort of like Afrofuturism and stuff like that, as like catharsis, of like when stuff is so bad you just scream it and it's bad and it's terrible, and you read that to sort of get that catharsis and get that feeling sort of kind of out of you, and being able to see it and look at it and touch it and not have it be something that's just in your own head, which is so important. But I was saying the other side of that is hope, the idea of being able to look at something where you see you see yourself and see yourself being happy and able to see that things can get better. And I think both of those are incredibly important parts of storytelling in general, but also, you know, in terms of like representing underrepresented voices. Like I see a lot of complaints of people being like, I don't want to see a story about being queer that ends with a character being real depressed, because
Yeah.
I'm a queer person who's real depressed, like, and I don't want to see that.
Mhm.
And so like it's a balance, and I don't think I would be able to tell the catharsis side of the story as well as I could try to tell a story that ends happily.
Mhm.
So I think both of these stories are important in the world, and I'll tell the ones that I feel like I can tell, and somebody else and other people absolutely will tell the stories about screaming into the void.
That's a really good question. Another one over here.
Wondering if there's
So this was a question about how Talia dealt with M not having any memories and how that was shockingly close to some real life experiences that people have had.
I mean, that was mostly from me just sort of anticipating what it would be like to not have memories. And I think a lot of it is hidden under trying to pretend that you do have the memories for me. So I think a lot of what was born of the experience of not having memories was born out of how you trying to pretend that you do, and figuring that out. And it was a lot of this idea of kind of what M was before she was M, which I don't have a solid answer for. The best I can address it was that she's sort of had this experience of nothingness, which I start the book out with. So that wasn't pulled from specific research. No.
Yeah, just done well.
Thank you.
Yeah. All right. Question over here.
Did you find yourself like cutting sections of your story with the pages, or did everything sync up perfectly, or did you be forced to add things when you could see it? What was that like for you, going from words to the document to the pictures on?
Yeah.
Yeah, so this one's about going from the script for the graphic novel to the thumbnails and laying things out and whether there were changes in between.
I spent so long writing that I wanted to make sure I knew everything that was going on in the scripts. I think when I script things out, I didn't script things out in terms of pages, but I was scripting things out in sort of like visualizing things in my head. Which, you know, I maybe should have written down more, because there was definitely times where I scripted stuff and I was like, I know what this is going to look like. And I came back to it later and I was like, what was I thinking? So it was a very tight transition. I think the only places where things came up is I had a couple places where I think I just wrote like cool science montage and I expected it to fill it in later. And I did. I had like 2 cool science montages. And I think they're like some of my favorite pages in the books because I had a lot of fun with them. But that was the least planned sections of my script. Everything else, I had a very strong idea of what I wanted things to look like, and I think it then just became about laying out the pages.
All right, I think I have time for one more audience question. Does anyone have anything they really, really want to know? Hello. Yeah. Oh, this one's
I
you're
always
so
forget
good.
to
It's
let
just
you
for
do
the
the
recording.
questions.
So this one is about because the story deals a lot with internal struggle, whether oh my God, I just lost it. And internal struggle and dialogue, how you showed that on the page.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and like keeping it from being repetitive,
Yeah.
which it totally makes, like, it's not an action story. So
Mhm.
you don't have to spend a lot of time like zooming out and being like, all right, this character is moving from here to here, and then they're doing this and they're picking this up. So it does become a lot about like figuring out stuff for the characters to do.
Mhm.
I think there's two sort of answers to this question. One of which is sometimes repetition is great. Repetition can be fantastic when used with the thought process of like, over the course of repetition, something happens, something gets worse, something gets better, something gets more intense, less intense. You know, if you've got 3 panels in a row of a character thinking something or doing something, like, how do you change that? It's like a held note in music. Does it crescendo? Does it decrescendo? Stuff like that. And the other side of it is actually pulled a lot from like the theater stuff I did in college, because a lot of it is, when you have a script, you've got some stage directions, but it's also a lot of like, okay, you could just stand there and say your line, but it's way more interesting if you give an actor and something to do, and you're like, I just want you to make tea during this scene. You want to go over there, fill up a cup of water, put it in here, figure that out. Even if it's, then you can layer that with like, oh, okay, this is actually works in with this other thing that the character is doing. So like I had a lot of fun putting characters during conversations and having to be like, okay, well, they're going to be like trying to extract eyeballs from weird plant things and stuff like that while they're talking, so that there's something to look at, something interesting to see.
Yeah, that's awesome. All right, with that final Q&A question, I want to thank you all so much for joining us, especially Talia. We are so happy to have you here. Folks, we have copies of M is for Monster at our front desk available for purchase, and we're going to be setting up a signing line as well towards the front of the store. And let's all just have a round of applause for Talia. Thank you all so much.
Thank you all so much.